Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on Parkview Trend Basics 1. My name is Aaron Mosher.
And I'm Paul Hickey.
And today we're going to be covering probably in a 2 or 3 part webinar series. We're going to cover some features that lead into the advanced features and trend. Today, Paul is going to go over things like trend value range options, some trend line options, and some of the options with trending with tag limits. But first of all, kind of some of the business work of the webinar. Just let you know, if you guys have any audio issues or questions, feel free to type them in at any time. For example, one thing to try with the audio is if you can't hear, maybe, or it's choppy, maybe you might have to dial in again. But also feel free, just any questions related to the topics that Paul will be discussing, pop in a question. I'll be monitoring those. I might type back to you, or Paul might take a break during the webinar and answer those questions. So, Paul, how about you take it from there?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Like Aaron said, we're going to be talking about some basics of trend today. We're calling this webinar Parkview Trend Basics 1. Like Aaron said, this will probably be the first in a series of webinars, kind of doing a deep dive into our trend display. Of course, the trend is fundamental to Parkview. It's a very deep module within the Data Park suite of applications, so we really can dive into it and pick it apart. So for today's topics, we're going to be talking about trend line options, so changing the appearance and to some extent the behavior of your trend lines or traces on the plot area of the trend. And then we're going to take a look at value range options. So that's optimizing your y-axis or your value range axis with using different modes for different purposes. And then we'll finish up today with talking about trending with tag limits. So that's using tag limits on the trend. And if you're familiar with that, we won't be going into alarms too much, but we have talked about alarms previously on webinars, and I'm sure we will again. And that actually takes us into, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping on that topic of past and future webinars. We are, of course, recording this webinar today, as we always do, and it will be available on our customer portal later today. In case you didn't know, there's an easy way to get to our customer portal directly from Parkview, right here on the Help tab. The button is labeled Submit Bug or Feature Request because that's one thing you can do on our portal. But if you just click that button, it will actually take you right to our customer portal. That's at support.captech.net. And if you have an account, you can hop in, and it's in our knowledge base. We have a video training section where we can find all of the webinar recordings that we have done previously. And in fact, we did a Trend Basics webinar, which is kind of an hour on a whole bunch of stuff in trend. Of course, today we're only talking about those 3 topics. But as you can see here from the date, getting a little bit stale at this point, so that's why we want to start updating our content on the trend. And just as an aside, I always mention this in the emails I send out, you can watch these videos directly on our customer portal, or you can always save a copy of the video for yourself for watching offline or later. Okay. So let's rewind a little bit and talk about what is trend. What do I mean when I say trend, and how does that tie into Parkview? So Parkview is a set of visualization tools for analysis of time series data. So naturally, an effective way to visualize that type of data is to plot the values against time. That's a trend. The way Parkview does trending, we plot all of our tags independently. So speaking generally, all the tags, the trend will assess that tag's values, its range, and plot them independent of the other tags in the trend. Now, we do have some types of behaviors that can make them move together, but the default behavior, again, is to plot independently. What that means is your tags can have different ranges, different draw modes. You can have multiple data types on the same trend. So that's numeric tags alongside text type tags, like a grade code or whatever value comes in as text. And the types of values can even be different. So you can be looking at actual values from your historian, or you can be looking at aggregated values like hourly averages, for example. But the common element there is always time, whether it's a single continuous time span, or if you're looking at a run set or a set of runs or time periods. And that's related to Run Browser, the multiple time span thing. If you're interested in that, we do have a webinar on that. So go watch that webinar. Okay. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some trends. All right, so this is an example of a multi-trend. What we're looking at here is multiple trends in the same window, or essentially on the same screen. But a trend is a trend is a trend. The basics of the operation don't change. The unique things to looking at multi-trend, of course, is I can, synchronize my time spans or run sets across all of my trends. But other than that, the point of the multi-trend is just looking at all these trends together in the same window. So I'm going to double click one of these to pop it up so we can take a closer look and start to look at the parts of the trend. So up at the top here, we have what's called the tag info grid. Rows and columns telling you what are the tags in the trend and some of the properties about them. So of course, first we have the tag column is the actual tag name versus description, which is our more verbose description of the tag. And then finally, min, max, and current. And what we're going to be interested in today, of course, is the min, max, and that's going to tie into our range options when we get to talking about that. On the left, the y-axis, and again, this is another topic we're going to be talking about today, where the value range is specified. And then, of course, in the middle, our plot area where we see the trend lines or traces. So first topic is going to be trend line options. What's going on here is my clone is staying on top of everything else. This is a ParkView feature called Topmost, where we helpfully try to keep certain windows on top of everything else. Helpful unless you're doing a presentation on it, of course. So trend line options, what are we going to talk about here? So the first category of trend line options is related to visual changes. So that would be things like changing the color of the tag, changing the color of the trend line, line thickness, line markers, which I'll talk about. But that's only related to the appearance of the trend line, not necessarily related to the data. Compared to value markers, which is going to allow you to highlight where actual values appear on the trend and to get some more information about those. And then the final category of options we're going to talk about are the draw mode and interpolation options, and those two kind of tie together, and we'll see how that works. So let's start with a fresh trend. So in ParkView Explorer, this is, if you're not familiar with it, very similar to Windows Explorer, of course. Your folders on the left, files on the right. I had already opened this trend, and if I wanted to make a new one, there's lots of ways to go about it. I can make a new blank trend. I can save a copy of an existing trend that I like. I can do a clone like I did with the double click feature and save that out as its own trend. But our kind of capstone recommended way of making a new trend, especially straight from ParkView, is by right-clicking in the file section and coming down to add display and then choosing your display type. Now the benefits to this are, first, I can immediately rename it. So now rather than having to go through the save dialog and give my file a name, I can name it directly from here. The other benefit is that it already exists in the folder I want to put it. And that starts to relate to Windows file and folder security, where obviously I wouldn't have been able to make this file if I didn't have permission to do it in the first place. So those are the reasons why we recommend making displays this way. So if I go ahead and open that up, here's my blank trend. I need to get some tags on here. So I'm going to open up the tag browser from the ribbon and grab a few tags, and I'm just putting them on the trend here with a drag and drop. Okay, so now we're looking at the trend of those 3 tags, but at a glance we can already see it looks like they're all kind of being plotted together, and maybe this blue tag is lower than the middle tag, the fuchsia tag, versus the green tag. But of course, that's not the case. I know that these values have different expected ranges, and so I can see that in the min-max section of my tag info grid, where they all have a min of 0, but max of 100, 500, and then 10. And so this is an example of how we plot these tags independently. The value range that's being shown right now is running from 0 to 10, and of course is color coded. It's corresponding to one of our trend lines here, and is corresponding to the 3rd tag in our tag info grid. Okay. So now let's start playing with the trend line options that I mentioned. Again, those were visual changes, value markers, and then draw mode interpolation. So the first thing I'll show you is changing the color of your trend lines. That's the very first box over here in the tag info grid, the leftmost column. If I right-click on the color, it opens up the color picker, and this is where we can manually specify our trend color lines if we want to change those. And the y-axis will change as well in terms of the color, so we can keep those in sync. Now, the trend has a notion of a default color scheme. So when I add more tags to the trend, it's always going to color them in the same order of colors, but that's configurable. And I'll just show you that now in trend properties. So by right-clicking, I can come through the context menu and open up our properties window and come to the colors tab of trend properties. And you see here in the default tag color section, this is the kind of the number or order scheme for the colors that I just mentioned. So you could change it here, or more likely, if you always wanted to use the same color scheme, you would build it and then save it out as what's called a theme, and then you could use that for all of your trends site-wide, which is probably what you would want. The other thing you can do with the color box is to hide the trend lines or traces. And I can do that just by clicking on the box. So you'll see that when I click it, it puts a little X in the color box and also hides the trend line. Now, the other thing you can do here, and this is maybe more common, is if I hold down the Control key and press or left click the color box, it's going to hide every trend line except for the one that I clicked. So this is a way to isolate a tag in a busy trend. And again, I can bring them all back just by doing the same thing in reverse, hold Control, click. I can toggle there back and forth. So that's about it that I can do for changing the trend lines themselves directly from the trend. For the rest of the options, we're going to have to go into the properties window. So if I right click on a tag, and again, through my context menu, open up the properties window. On the tag config tab of the trend properties window, this is where all of your tag specific properties are located. And this is where I can change some of the line properties. So, color is the first option here. This is just a redundant way to set the color of the trend lines. No difference in functionality there. The next one I want to show is line width. So right now, my trend lines might be kind of skinny from a visual standpoint. especially depending on, the size and resolution of your monitor and the distance of the viewer from the screen. So if I bump up the line width of that first tag there, you'll see I get a fatter line, a fatter trace, which is a little bit easier to maybe see. The other thing we can do is to add what's called a line marker. So I'm going to check off line marker and just hit apply. It's a little hard to see right now, but what's happened is that there's a marker or dot that's been placed on the tag that I was just manipulating, and it's being placed at every single grid line. To make that a bit easier to see, I'm going to change my dot size multi, which essentially it's the dot size multiplier. So this is how much bigger to make our dots. Just for illustration, I'm going to bump this up to 5. And I'm also going to change the dot type because that's related as well. So I'll go ahead and change this to a square. And maybe I'll also throw a triangle dot on another tag as well, just to illustrate what's going on. Okay. So here's my larger, now square sized line markers. I see the triangle line markers up here. And what's important is in the tag info grid in the color column, the corresponding shapes have been put next to the tag that corresponds to the trend line. So this is helping you, visually match up your tags to the trend lines, and it's doing it in a way that is not color coded. So that obviously, if you have color blindness, our color coding scheming for the trend lines is pretty useless to you. And also, if you're in the habit of printing out trends, on pieces of paper, obviously, if you don't need to use your color toner, that would be great. So if you print in grayscale, our color scheme again is useless. So this is where the line markers come into play. All right. Now let's take a look at some of the value range options. Or sorry, no, value marker options. We'll get to the range eventually, I promise. So value markers is we're talking about actual values, data points in the historian that the trend is plotting. So the first one, and this is a very common feature that we see our customers use. We use this in troubleshooting. Some people I know like to just leave it on all the time. It's called toggle dots. So I can access that by right-clicking on a tag and coming down to the Apply to Tag section and choose Show Dots. And then this was for the disk tank density tag, the one currently with the blue trend line. So what happened? It looks like it got maybe a little thicker, or I see dots around here. What's going on is these are all of the actual data points. So as I zoom in, each of these dots represents an actual known value in historian. Anything in between the dots is being calculated by the trend, or it would be, if I requested the value at that time between the dots, it would be an interpolated value, meaning that it's not an actual data point that was historized, but we can guess at what the value was between those 2 points. But in any case, dots is a great tool for finding out where is the actual values, how far apart are they, do we have any gaps in the data, things like that. A related property is, oops, I can do this right from the right click menu. It's also in the Apply to Tag section. It's called Show Value Text. So when I enable that, rather than putting a dot, and these are not tied together, I can have one without the other, but it does kind of help to show what's going on. It's going to put the actual value and timestamp on the trend. Now you'll notice when I back up, I start to lose resolution of data until it finally disappears. So this is a kind of feature where we only show it when we can. You really only see it when you get really zoomed into a smaller time span. But this again can be a great troubleshooting tool. It's also great for doing a screenshot where people can see what the numbers were at the time and things like that. I do believe we have a feature request in to just show values instead of time, or to try to force it to show values. I know there was a question about that, so it might be what you want. Okay, now I'm going to hop into talking about draw modes and interpolation settings, and those two kind of tie together. Okay. So draw mode, what that is it essentially boils down to when we're, when the trend is plotting the trend lines or the traces, are we playing connect the dots, or do we only draw horizontal and vertical lines? And that roughly corresponds to whether we are looking at continuous or discrete data. For example, are we looking at process data where it's being, continually historized, and we have dead banding rules and all of that to make sure we're capturing all the data we need to recreate what happened, compared to, again, discrete type data, which might be like lab samples, where the value is only being sampled every so often, and we can't assume what's going on in between. And that's what the interpolation is all about. So interpolation is how does the trend handle the spaces between actual data points. So again, the kind of the two main options that roughly correspond to continuous versus discrete data. So we can linearly interpolate values, assuming the value is changing continuously, and again, assuming the historization logic is good. Or the other option is to just hold the last known value until we get a new point, not making any assumptions about how it's changing in between the data points we have in history. So let's take a look at how that works. So what I've got in this trend is the same tag added twice. And of course, that's something you can do. And now I'll just move one of my tags so we can see them rather than being right on top of each other. And now I'm going to come into properties and change the draw mode of one of my tags. So you'll find that again in the tag config section over here in draw mode. So right now they are both have a draw mode of regular, which again corresponds to continuous, compared to the rest of our options, with the exception of the exception draw mode, which are going to be more of the draw only horizontal vertical. For right now, I'm only going to show you the regular and square draw modes, and I'll show you examples of the rest of them in just a bit. So again, I'm going to change one of my draw modes to square, and keep an eye on the interpolation while I do this. Change it to square, and you'll notice the interpolation automatically changed. And that's again because we're assuming if you want a regular draw mode for your tag, you want a continuous interpolation. Whereas with a draw mode of square for a tag, we assume you want a state interpolation, or again, what's known as hold the last value, hold the state of the tag. Now you could mix and match these if you want to, if you had a good reason for it. But I'm going to stick with this kind of default example for now. And I will also come back to manual. But let's just take a look at what it does with these current settings. And as you can see, again, rather than playing connect the dots, we are seeing only vertical and horizontal lines. Where you can see the interpolation mode is in, for example, Smart Mouse. So I'm going to turn on my Smart Mouse for this display. Oops. And again, Smart Mouse, this is just, wherever I put my mouse on the screen at that time, the vertical time slice under my cursor is going to show me what that actual timestamp is, and then followed by the values for the tags that I have. Now, keep an eye on the values as I pan around here and how they will be different. So notice how the blue tag, its value is changing, as I pan between the known data points, as you see down there, is because we're sloping down. And with the interpolation mode of continuous, we can assume that it's, changing continuously between those 2 points. So right now the trend is linearly interpolating this value based on the 2 actual data points on either side, compared to the green tag, which is holding the last known value. All right, so that is draw modes and interpolation very briefly. Like I promised, let me show you the other draw modes. So I just popped over into the help manual here where I know I have some pictures of them in the trend properties section under the tag config tab. So continuous, we already talked about. Again, it's playing connect the dots, or to put it more formally, draws a direct line from point to point. And it will extend the last data point to the current time, which you can kind of see there. Oh yeah, you can zoom, that's cool. So here you can see that kind of like that little extra point where it builds. Probably isn't flattening out in terms of like a support or are we flatlining thing. The trend will do this until it gets another data point. So a tag like this is always going to look like it's flatlining out from the last known point. Compared to, I'm going to zoom down here, to exception, which is the other connect the dot style, except it does not do the extend the last known, doesn't build the line, so to speak. And that ties into its name, which means it will only plot a new point on exception, or when it gets a new value, when there's a change. So the rest of our options are all square or state type draw modes, where we do a horizontal and then the vertical in square. Square no edge is just going to not draw the vertical lines. State is just like square, except it will build, whereas square will not. State no edge, you kind of get the idea. And the last one, square X, Y. The only difference here from square is it will go vertical first and then horizontal. So all of that comes down to different trending philosophies and why you would want to use those different draw modes. This might be a good time to bring Aaron back in and first check in to see if we have any questions we need to address. And also, Aaron, if you have any thoughts on the philosophy behind those draw modes or interpolation settings.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We did have a couple questions come in, but I typed some answers and might reach out to people offline. But one thing I thought about to mention about interpolation, and as you showed with the smart mouse, you could see the line interpolating. Don't know if you're going to get into this, but another place that interpolation affects is quick statistics. And quick statistics is a way that we calculate statistics, as Paul will show, of the data on the trend. And of course, things like time average and a few other statistics, interpolation type comes into play too. So we don't see it here as much because our tags are all kind of 1 minute data and et cetera.
Right.
But how you interpolate the data between data points will affect things like the time average statistics. So it is kind of important to know that, and we've had many conversations with customers during training classes, really understanding your data and how the data is getting in. And at your site, you may have noticed that as you drag tags in the trend, it will sometimes automatically pick state for you or automatically pick continuous. And that's where the trend is querying the underlying historian, whether that be our historian or a third-party historian. And sometimes it can get things like draw modes and state modes from those historians. So sometimes it'll pick automatic. Sometimes you're using the techniques that Paul showed you, where you have to go and make that change on your own because you know it's an on-off tag and interpolation makes no sense. So That's just a little bit that I wanted to add.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Aaron. That was good stuff. And yeah, that's a good note about the kind of the notion of tag defaults. And I'm going to come back to that idea when we start to talk about range options here in a couple minutes. But the last thing I want to show before we move on from this is, as I mentioned, that manual interpolation type. So let's say you had a lab type tag, or I'm going to grab an MDE tag that has discrete data and also more disparate data, and you wanted to line up what was going on at the time of a test in your process. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on dots for this calcium lab tag that I just added. Maybe back up a little bit, find some samples. Okay, here we go. So where we see, the value changing here, where we have a dot is another sample. Let's say we just wanted to see an aggregated value at the time of when these samples were taken for the other tags in the trend. So if I come into properties, and for the tag that I want to be the driver, if you will, of the interpolation, I can change its interpolation mode to manual. And the way I remember that, again, is I called it the driver tag. I drive a stick shift. My car's manual transmission. So that's how I remind myself that, oh, manual, that's right, manual transmission, I'm driving. This is the driver tag. So if I choose that and hit apply, nothing's going to happen right away. And that's because if we are talking about interpolating tags to each other, that's a concept called normalization. That's when we're kind of, rather than just looking at raw values, we are choosing where we want to see values in time and then lining things up in time. Again, that's kind of what we call normalization. So just really quickly in Run Browser, again, if you're interested in this kind of thing, we do have a whole webinar on this. Go watch that webinar. But just for right now, if I'm normalizing to manual, there's lots of places you can do this. This is just one example. Unload that run. Now you'll see my calcium tag didn't change. These are the same points, but now we also are getting a point for our process tags only where our lab tag had a point. The other settings were retained. Again, it's the same tag twice. But again, this is just showing you now all of our values line up at the same timestamps. And it's being driven, again, by the tag that we set as the interpolation mode of manual. If you're curious what actual value we are seeing here, it's not being explicitly shown to you. We probably would need to add an aggregate picker next to this normalization option. But I can guarantee you what you're seeing on the trend right there is time averages. It would be pretty cool if we could also say, give me the max over the period and all that, but I'm sure we'll get that into a future version. Okay. Now let's start talking about value range options.
And Paul, just want to interject that I love these webinars at times because I learned something new too. I honestly did not know we could do that. That is, that's pretty neat. Just a little sad to realize in a generation or two, your definition of how to remember manual is probably going to go away as well. There won't be
It is sad, I know.
But no, that was, I honestly didn't know we could do that. That's great.
All right. Brownie points. Okay, so then value range. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the range gets determined. There's kind of two ways that we do that. There's the default range, and this is kind of what Aaron was talking about with a tag having a notion of a default draw mode interpolation. It also has a default plot min and plot max that is being set at the historian level. Again, we always say park view sits on top of things. So if you want to, you could change that plot min, plot max at the historian level, and then you won't have to be changing it in park view. But you're not locked into your default tag range. We can change that on the fly, or we can also be changing our range dynamically. I'll get to that in a bit, but in a sentence, what that means is the data known to the trend helps the trend decide the plot range for the tags. And in terms of how and where the range can be set, there's many ways and places. So let's just jump right in and take a look. So first off, the first place to change the value range is actually directly in the tag info grid. I can type in here. So I could change this to 50 to 100 or 50 to 80. And you'll see that it's updating there. And this is an example of a change that will stick with the trend. So again, you can customize your value ranges here by trend. If you wanted it to be changed universally, that's at the historian level. The other way to change is to do, and you may have seen me do this already, is by just sliding on the y-axis. I can just grab this and move it up and down, and it will also update the min and max there. And now I'm going to show an option for customizing the y-axis. A phrase we like to use is when in doubt, right click. Well, we hide lots of right click menus throughout ParkView. This is an example. You can right click the y-axis and get some options. And the first one I want to talk about is show all y-axis. So this is pretty cool. So far, I've been locked into only seeing one tag's value range at a time. And here I can obviously see all three at once. So the only drawback, of course, is you're losing a little bit of screen real estate. But the benefits here, of course, I can see all of my value ranges simultaneously, especially if they have very different plot ranges. This is super valuable, and especially with taking screenshots or printing. That way, people aren't trying to look up into the grid, okay, figure out what the ranges are, and then visually line it all up. You can just get all that information right here on the trend. And then the last cool piece, I can still slide and move these around. And of course, I can do it individually because that's what you'd want to do, right? Okay. And we will come back to common access in just a bit. But for now, the trend properties window has the rest of the options that we are going to want to look at. Oh, I just lied, except for one. Before we move on, I want to show auto scale. So this is something you can enable from the trend, from the context menu. So if I right click on a tag and come down to apply to tag, I can choose auto scale. And now, and that was for the, I think I did that for the third tag. No, the first one, okay. So let's remember, hold control and click on my color box, and that's going to hide everything except for this blue tag. So we can just isolate that and take a look at it and keep an eye on the range. So auto scale, just like it sounds, is going to be reassessing the tags values in the trend in order to just nicely accommodate whatever values are being shown. So benefits and drawbacks to that. Benefit, your trend lines are always going to be in your trend so you can see them. Drawback, if the values start to go wildly out of their expected range, you may not notice it at a glance. There's all sorts of good reasons for using auto scale, but there is kind of that inherent danger of things drifting away from what you expect. And for that reason, if I were to save this right now, it would not save that auto scale option. If you want to save your trend to auto scale, you have to come into properties. So now is where I can dive into the properties window for the rest of these options. So here on the tag config tab, scroll over to auto scale. And this is where if you wanted a tag to always be auto scaled, you have to check it off and then save it that way. And so this is just forcing you to take that extra step to explicitly acknowledge that you do want it to always be auto scaled. Okay. Now let's take a look at what we call the range options or range modes. I'm going to pull up a different trend here. Okay. So we have 6 different range options, and these all tie into tag limits, which is going to kind of be a natural segue into our next topic, of course. But the idea here is if you have tag limits set up, you can use those to be determining your range. And this gets more useful, of course, if you are looking at a grade-based process area where you're going to have grade-based limits that are changing based on your operating conditions or changing based on what grade you're currently running. Because of course, if that's the case, if your expected value range isn't always the same, we need to be able to dynamically grab whatever it is that we want and use that range. So these get set up in, again, on the tag config tab over on the range options. And again, here's the 6 options. Absolute or none is the first one. And that just means that I'm using the plot min, plot max with no dynamic behavior. And we've already seen that. So the rest of them are going to be using limits. So we have current, target, limit, all limit, limit sigma. Again, those are just going to correspond to the trends that I've kind of already built here. So let's just take a look at the first one, current. What this is actually going to do, I already lied to you, this isn't necessarily related to limits. This is just going to take whatever the current value of the tag is and then center the tag's current value while keeping the difference between the plot min and the plot max. Kind of hard to see as I'm jumping around, but the idea behind the current mode is that it always keeps your current value in the middle of your screen. So you see here as I jump it around, there's kind of something else that's going on related to that, which is y-axis rounding, which is why it isn't always perfectly hitting in the middle. But the idea there is just keeping the current value centered on your trend line without changing the absolute range around it. The next is the target. Again, very similar to current, it's just keeping the target in the center instead of the actual value. And this is related to the target limit, or the center yellow line you see there. The next option is the limit range mode, which is going to be using the current limits to assess the range. So right now, on this grade, I have an upper limit for this tag of, go and click on it so I can see the range. Looks like it's about 5. And so that's what's determining our min max there, or maybe a little less than 5. If I pan back to a previous grade run, now it's going to jump around and continually to be moving so that just the current limits are visible. So you see previously here, I can't see the limits at all because they're outside of that range now. If there are limits there, looks like no. Compared to, so that's looking at one limit at a time. The next option is all limits, which is going to, no matter what, take the highest high and the lowest low. I can back out to show that. So that no matter what we're looking at, we can see all of it in the same screen. You see here we have very widely different, limit ranges for this tag depending on what grade we're running. And the last option is similar to all limits, or sorry, similar to the limit, except the limit is just going to try to nicely fit the range around the current limits, whereas limit sigma is a bit more specific. That's going to evaluate the difference between the target limit and the upper limit, and then add a third of that value to the upper limit to get the plot max. And the same logic would then apply to calculating the plot min as a distance from a third of the value of the difference between the target limit and the lower limit. Okay. The last range feature to show is common axis. I skipped over it. That was on the right-click menu for the y-axis. But the notion here, so I'm looking at a trend of tags that all have pretty widely different min-maxes. And this is kind of like an auto-scale all, except it's going to force all of the tags to use the same min and the max while keeping all of the tags still visible in the trend. So let me just show you that. So my min, my max, I'll jump to roughly the same values. And now if I start doubling back, you'll see all of them are jumping around at the same range to make sure that we can still fit all of the data. So while we have these lower values, everything is still going to try to be just, squeezing into the screen. So this is kind of a less hassle way to keep all of your tags visible at the trend all the time. All right. Aaron, any questions or thoughts before we hit our last topic?
We did have one question come in that I think you could show real quick. One was asking if they could draw the same tag twice, but have one of them shifted, time shifted by 5 minutes. So unrelated to kind of where you're going, but kind of a side question I know you could probably show an example of real quick.
I could. So what Aaron was asking about, of course, I mean, can we shift the tags time or shift the tags values in time? Yes, in the right-click menu in the Apply to All section, it's time delta drag. So when that's enabled, we get an extra time axis down at the bottom, and you just click and drag. You see here, I am moving that tag in time. And this, you don't have to have the same tag twice. It's not necessarily related to that. You can do this for any old tag. Probably more likely you'd have two different tags that you know are related in time, but not, the cause is maybe separated from the effect by a certain amount of time, and that's how much you'd want to time shift it. So there I was able to just do a drag to get a time shift of, you see here with the little, arrow saying this tag is being time shifted backwards by 1 hour. I did that right on the trend, but more likely you would want to be a bit more precise with that. And that's another option on our tag config properties is the delta time expression. So here's the tag I tried to time shift. So you can see there I tried to make it about an hour and I got pretty close, but not exactly an hour. So if you wanted to, you could come in here and make it exactly minus 1 hour. Or this is kind of cool actually. In this field, you'll see I have a tag icon, which opens the tag browser. Why? Well, instead of putting a fixed value for the time expression here, I can actually put a tags value. So two things with that. That could be a calculated tag that would then be constantly calculating that expression, or it could be an MDE tag or lab type tag where you could be manually entering the time shift and then change it, or maybe using the same time shift tag in multiple places, and that way you could make the one change and have it propagated out to a bunch of other places where you're doing time shifts. Okay.
Great, thanks for the call. And if that didn't cover the question, please shoot us a clarification, or I'll try to reach out to them afterwards if they want a little more detail. But thanks for taking a break and showing that.
Yep. Okay, so last one, and there's not as much to talk about with this topic as we have with the others. So I'll just go through this briefly. But that's using tag limits on the trend. We've kind of already seen that with the range modes and all of that. We're not done yet. So let me just walk you through this process and what the general capabilities are. So looking here at a trend of one tag, I can right click. And again, in this tag specific context menu, I have options for limits. And what you see here are, it says control and it says spec. These are limit types. So this tag has two different sets of limits for it. And if I choose one, it's going to enable that limit type for my tag on the trend. We see that here with the red lines for my upper and lower, and then a yellow target line. If a tag has limits enabled and the trend is saved, it's going to save it with those limits turned on. So the next time I come in here, it's going to remember the limits that I had specified. So that's how you do that. Like I mentioned, we do have multiple limit types, and we can have more than one limit type at once. And that's going to kind of help you also visualize the purpose behind multiple limit types. So if I turn on my other limit type of spec and start moving around in time, here's a good example. Let me bump this down a bit so we can get in the middle of our trend. So you'll see we kind of have a set of limits that are close in and a set of limits that are wider around our target. And that's kind of the one example of how you would use multiple limit types. So maybe tighter limits for tracking excursions that you can fix, and wider limits, the violation of which is going to indicate that you have a more serious problem. You might be throwing away some product. Related to all of this is the what we call alarm bar that you see down here at the bottom. Now this got turned on automatically when I enabled my tag limits. And what it's doing is it's going to fill in an event, or highlight the section of time where we had a limit violation. Now, if you are using Alarm Server, you're familiar with alarms and all of that, Alarm Server would be doing this automatically. So in some cases, Alarm Server can replace this functionality. However, there are times maybe where you'd want to at least be able to visually see where excursions are happening kind of independently from the types of events that you want to be tracking in your database. And we'll probably go into more depth on this topic in a future webinar, especially in new versions coming up where we are adding more functionality around this section of trend. For right now, the last thing I'll show you is, again, when in doubt, right click. This alarm bar has a context menu that can allow you to choose what type of alarm events we want to be seeing down here. So this right now is a spec event that's being triggered by a spec limit violation. I can show control events instead. And so right now we have no control violations. Or I can choose to hide all of them. Or the final option, you may have noticed wherever my trend line was exceeding a limit, it changes to red. If you don't want that, again, right click, hide calculated alarms and line colors is going to not give you that color change functionality when we trip over a trend line, or sorry, tag limit line. Okay, that was all of the content I had on the agenda today. So I think I'll check in with Aaron one more time for questions and final comments.
Right now we have a one pending question, but I would encourage anybody else to add any that are coming to mind. The question was about saving the trend with all the modifications that we did. in order that when we reopen the trend in the future, we'll have the last all those settings. So I think it's like, as you said, Paul, a lot of the stuff when you go into the properties and change properties, those will all stick, correct?
Yeah, and that's kind of the hand waving I've been doing in the training I've been doing. If you want it to stick, make sure it's set in properties. But what I'm kind of doing there is getting around the fact that I really need to write up a document, get it on our portal of what changes that you make to the trend outside of properties will be saved with it and what changes won't. And maybe in that process, we might discover some gaps in functionality. So yeah, that's a good question, and one that, the easy answer is just set it in properties. A better answer for us would be to kind of have a cheat sheet for what things you can change on the fly and what things won't stick. Because things like the min, the max you can change and it will, auto scale won't, and things like that. So that's what I would say to that question.
And then auto scale is one that you can go into properties and force it to start an auto scale, so that one will stick. And if you toggle on and off dots and you save it, dots will stick. So there, like you said, there are inconsistencies, and we've tried to make some decisions going down the road of what are things people want to stick and what are things people just want to have as a temporary, oh, let me just check this, and would almost be surprised if they stuck. But yeah, Paul, you're definitely right. We getting some for us to build that up as a stick not stick list and make an easy link to that would be good.
Yeah, we'll tell the technical writer to get right on that.
Yeah, we'll be sure to mention it to them. Right now there aren't any other questions, and I don't have new things to add after being humbled by learning something new.
All right. Well, I guess that's going to wrap it up then. Thanks everyone for attending today. And again, look out for the recording of this webinar later today on our customer portal, which again is here, support.captech.net. And stay tuned for future webinars. Our next webinar will probably either be another on trend, or I might get back to doing another webinar on graphic designer and pick up where I left off on the last one there. So again, thanks everyone. Thanks Aaron, and we'll see you all again. Have a good rest of your day.
Hey, thank you. Bye.